Before we kind of kick off, before we kick off this conversation, just want to ground in the word impact. We throw it around so much, but what does it really mean? When we say impact, we're talking about the change in the outcome, a condition or a state of well-being as a result of an organization or a program or an initiative. And remember, this can be positive or negative and intended or unintended. And so given that, impact measurement and management is a set of practices that we can use to measure, learn, and report social impact and those changes. And this can be used in any impact initiative. It's framework agnostic, so you can use it with your volunteer programs, philanthropic giving, or even ESG. And really what it's all about is identifying and considering the positive and negative effects of a program and figuring out how to mitigate the negative impacts while maximizing your positive impacts. And to do this, we often use tools like logic models, theories of change, and SROI, that's social return on investment analyses. And you've probably run into these terms as you've been working, and it's closely related and often used interchangeably with things like measurement and evaluation and also social impact measurement. Now, sometimes impact measurement can feel like this, like you're on a big uphill climb. And it can also feel like this, like it's just a bunch of old reports gathering dust. And sometimes it can maybe feel like this, well, sort of, but probably more like that with our shark at the beach. But all in all, impact measurement can feel like a really big undertaking. And something that can make the difference between it feeling like being on the beach without the shark or climbing up a mountain is something that we don't talk about very often, and that is usefulness. Because we don't do impact measurement for our health. I mean, we kind of do in this like big picture ESG, social impact, this is all for us kind of way, but that's, a different conversation for a different day. And we don't want that work to sit on a shelf and just gather dust. We want it to be used. So how do we get there? How do we do impact measurement in a manner that's going to be both useful and used? So that's really what our conversation is going to hinge on today. Because in order for impact measurement to be used and useful, it has to matter. And to do measurement that matters, there's some questions that we need to be asking ourselves up front before we're even getting started. And so that we can ground the work that we're doing in those answers. So we have to think about, who is it for? Is it for an internal audience or an external audience? How is this going to be used? What types of decisions is it going to be used for? What types of activities? Are there strategy decisions? Is it for reporting? And when is it going to be needed? Are there critical time points throughout our business year that we're going to be needing this information? And if so, how is that going to be needed? What's the format? Is it a report? Is it a presentation? Is it a dashboard? Is it a conversation? So we need to think about the context in which we're working before we even begin. And if we're not thinking about these things up front and designing our efforts with our end users in mind, it's going to be really difficult to thread that needle after the fact and make it useful kind of in a post hoc way. So given all of this kind of tee up, I'm really excited to have Mariana from Justworks with us, who's going to talk to us a bit about doing measurement and reporting in a way that's useful and used. So welcome, Mariana. And so I'm going to just ask some questions. We're going to have a conversation here and kind of keep this a little bit conversational and informal. So I'd love to hear about how you have approached this question of usefulness when it comes to data and measurement.
I love this question. I love this conversation. So happy to be able to be here with you all today. And so I think I'll go back to kind of the first point on something you mentioned is like, what is it going to be used for? And so I think from my perspective and my role, there's two ways in which we've been looking at impact measurement. One is for our reporting needs, right, which is like ESG, all that really, really fun stuff. And then the other is for what I sort of put in the bucket of like advancement and scaling our programs, right? And that's I think where the usefulness really of this all like comes into, right? Because I think we need to be looking at how do we design, let's say, a process and a framework that allows us to collect data that is useful for reporting from a sort of regulation perspective and all the things that we have to do, but that it's also going to help us understand how we're actually doing our work, where change is happening, where change is not happening, like what's changing within like the programs that we want to have, right? How can we innovate? Where's there like continuous improvement, right? And I think that's mainly what I focus on, starting with that question and then really connecting it back to like, again, like the reporting, which is like not as fun, if you will, right? But just equally important, right? From a regulations perspective.
Great. So you mentioned kind of continuous improvement and advancing and scaling programs. And that sounds to me like there's both ensuring that the work that you're doing is getting where it needs to go, but then also being able to communicate it internally. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what that process is like and how you bring data and measurement into those?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces to it. I think one is, sort of how do we like tell the story of what we're doing to our employees, to leadership. A lot of that is through personal accounts, which, if you're doing impact measurement, that's like one of the sources of data that you can gather, right? And then the other one is like really like numbers, right? And so really finding the connection between the two and sort of narrating what your program is doing and how it's sort of like making changes. And within that also being very conscious, and we're really big on sort of like being very honest of where we are, right? Like if we have a program that's like not having the intended impact, like you mentioned at the beginning, like what are the stories that tell us that that's our reality? And then that's when you go into like the advancement or the scaling or the like adjusting or that continuous learning, which is like, what are the things that I need to change within that program, right? So there's like, yeah, the external storytelling, and I say external to my team. And then, sort of things that are a little more tangible, like I collect data quarterly, right? So I can like see how often are like the changes that I'm making sort of moving the needle or not, right? Like sort of I can like do that sort of, I look at it as like, again, like the continuous improvement, like a wheel, right? It's like you measure, you act, you reflect, you measure, you act. It's like that, doing it continuously, even if your program is doing great. I am really like a firm believer of like always living in that sort of wheel, because things change, right? And priorities change. So being able to have that picture and understanding of how your program is sort of developing and executing and kind of coming to life through that data and like that information, and then connecting it back to the business or, the world, like the things that are actually affecting and become variables to being able to continue to do the work.
I love that. I think you said measure, act, and reflect. Measure, act, and reflect. And I do see very much it becomes a cycle of collect that information, do something with it, and then kind of see what worked and what didn't work. And you're kind of doing it all over and continuously all over again. I'm wondering if you have any advice for us about how you approach that measure, act, reflect, or any advice for us as we do this work.
Yeah, I think, I think impact measurement, you like said it in your initial setting, right? It's got this like very scary, like daunting sound to it. And I spent some time working in innovation, and I think one of the things that I learned the most about sort of taking a card from entrepreneurs playbooks, let's say, is like it's okay to fail. Like if we don't continuously look at the cycle of measuring, acting, and learning as like an opportunity to improve, and we look at it as like not achieving or not getting to our outcomes, then that's when we like sort of stagnate and find ourselves in a very like overwhelming state, right? Obviously, we need to sort of be reaching our goals. We need to be sort of delivering on results. But how do you find that balance between your approach to it, I think is the key, right? Like I talk a lot in like pilot. Like I'm always like, let's try this. We're going to do a pilot on this. And then we're going to see what the data says. And then we're going to like continue improving this pilot. And then maybe I do like 3 pilots in a thing. And then it's like that third one is the actual program. and then we just improve on that program, right? But it's all perspective. Ultimately, from the first pilot, I'm already doing the work, right? I'm already like creating some impact. And so I think it is really on like that perspective shift on like how can you learn from each of those cycles instead of sort of look at that as like a failure, right? And that's like a life thing too.
That's
Just
right.
not doing life things right now, good measurement, but you know.
It's all very, connected and philosophical. And what I'm hearing is there's, not boiling the ocean, not trying to take it on all of it too much, pick starting with something that you can wrap your head around, but then also what I imagine is that using the terms of a pilot when you're communicating and talking about it internally can help orient and reorient around learning. Because often the differences between learning and reporting can almost feel in conflict, that you have this number, we've got to hit it, but we also need to be doing learning. But if it's couched in the language of a pilot, you're really able to bring along your internal stakeholders. And I think that internal stakeholder piece is so important and central to this conversation. I mean, obviously, as we teed us up, we're thinking about those questions. How is this going to be used? Often the data that we create and we pull isn't even used by us. It's being used by other teams in other places. So I'm wondering if, as we're kind of coming up on a close, if you might speak a little bit to how you have brought in your internal stakeholders, maybe your external stakeholders, in being able to understand what's going to be needed, what's going to be useful, what's going to be used.
Yeah, I like this question a lot because I think there's some pre-work that needs to happen here, right? And that's like you alluded to it, it's in like setting those expectations, right? So for many of us, one of our main stakeholders are our marketing teams, right? Like what are the stories that we're telling? How is this connected to our brand? How are we like really sharing that like impact story so we can like gain more brand awareness? And that turns into like probably maybe hopefully more customers or clients, right? So like I think having initial conversations and understanding what are their goals, right? And how you build your program and the like measurement around your program start supporting those goals and then bringing them along with you, right? Not in a sense of like, oh, I need to be reporting to them, but like make them feel connected to the work that you're doing, I think is really important. I've seen that be really successful for us in like, whenever I maybe like, again, I work really well with like quarterly, right? So every quarter I constantly am in conversation with our grantees, for example, right? Every quarter I'll maybe send an update to our marketing team. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of data on it or like a lot of things that they can use right away, but it gives them context on what are the things that are happening and how the program is evolving. And so they also understand where opportunities may lie in the future. And then they can come back to me and be like, you know what, Mariana, this is really important for us. Why don't we go down that path a little bit more? And then that's also part of my like shift on learning, right? Because I'm obviously here to like serve our grantees and like our nonprofits and like the service that we intend to do from like a social impact perspective. But I also need to serve my internal stakeholders. So how do I have both hats on at the same time? And so I guess like a really good way of looking at it is when you're building whatever your sort of like your cycle of like learning or improvements going to look like, you're also needing to think about those internal stakeholders and what information they're interested in and when are those key moments to share that information with them.
Amazing. I really appreciate how tangible your advice for us has been. And if I might just kind of recap what I've heard, I think some of the big takeaways I have is obviously, like we said, like don't boil the ocean, but it almost sounds like you're using the cadence, the natural business cadence to make this a continuous conversation. It's not something where you're popping in once a year or maybe twice a year to have this conversation. It is always ongoing, and using kind of what is already embedded in how the business is doing business to plug in and bring along your stakeholders. So you're really thinking about what their needs are. And using language that's going to feel approachable for them, using the language of pilot, using, rather than, evaluation or quality improvement, which can be very scary, but pilot can feel very much more approachable and gentle. So really, really thank you. I love these tangible takeaways. I'm sure that everyone on this call found them incredibly useful. And thank you so much. I love this conversation. I feel like we could just keep going.
So far.
Yeah. But I think we're wrapping up. So thank you so very much.
Thank you all.
So Morgan, before we wrap up, I have a question for you. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit
Right.
because normally we would let you know the questions ahead of time, but we haven't. So this is it. This is your moment. Stick with me.
Live.
I'm curious, we called this webinar kind of a get started or an intro, right, to impact
Yeah.
measurement. So I'm curious, if I'm a social impact person, let's say I just started my role, we have some data, there might've been someone before me who started looking at evaluation and measurement, right? What's kind of the first thing I want to do? I'm overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. Like, what's that first thing I want to do to get started?
Yes. I mean, I think this is a great question because I've been in this situation more times than I can count at this point. And where I always start is conversations. And I think to Mariana's point is understanding the needs, understanding the priorities, and talking to everyone without an agenda, just putting on like my learning hat and just tell me like what's keeping you up at night. Like what is hard right now? What are the problems you're trying to solve? I'm not coming to them with answers. I'm not coming with solutions, just with learning and listening. And that does a few things. One, it gives me like a good sense of the lay of the land, which is really important. But I'm also building trust with my stakeholders and starting to think about like where I'm going to be plugging them in. And that is usually the very first place that I start. And then that allows me to create a learning framework, to create an impact measurement plan that's going to meet at some support those individuals or those teams or those programs, like really where they are. Sometimes that can feel like in antithesis to like, let's get going and let's get started. But I think, even building it in, it really makes the difference between like, we've done all this stuff and like no one's using it. We really want our work to be of meaning and be supportive of both decision-making and then also, the external reporting and accountability that we're required to have. So that is where I'd recommend. And that is where I personally start anytime I'm in that position.
Awesome. Mariana, anything to add to that?
That was so perfect. I think that's
She's
I would
good.
just like
She's good.
double click on like the trust piece, right? Don't boil the ocean. And I think the other one is like, you don't need to act right away, right? Like think of it like someone was there probably before, or like people have been thinking about this thing being like a going. Like, what if you're the person that's like, all right, let's take a step back, let's slow down, let's reflect and like bring in all the different perspectives and maybe like find something new, right? So I think that taking the time at the beginning always makes the rest of whatever you're building really be much more like effective and successful.
Agreed.
So thank you, Morgan and Mariana. We have a couple minutes here for questions. So if folks want to put questions into the chat, we might be able to take a couple questions here on the call. We're also going to be taking questions, in our community as well. So in order to make the best use of our time and keep people from being on Zoom any longer than we have to be, we're all zoomed out, right? We're going to ask that you post your questions again here in the chat. We have time to take a couple if there's a couple quick ones. And then we're going to ask you to post in our community, and we will have our experts there to answer your questions in our community. And I'll put the link in the chat in just a minute here, and we'll send out the deck so that you have instructions on how to get there. But very simply, there's an impact measurement group in our community. You can just post there with the label of question. We also have a special bonus surprise for you today, and that is the impact measurement toolkit. So this is a great toolkit. Morgan and Mariana have both contributed to this content. It's great content, gets you kind of started on your impact measurement journey. So we'll put that in the chat as well. Thank you to our other host here who's putting that in the chat for me. So you can take a look at that. Anybody have a quick question for our experts today that they can go ahead and answer on the call? A quick question about leveraging other teams. Have you ever leveraged other teams at your company to help you with measurement or analysis, or are there other data sort of teams that you involve at your companies? Either Morgan or Mariana, any experience with that?
I imagine we both do, but do you want to answer first, Mariana?
Sure. So yes, always yes, especially with this work. And so I think that the ways in which we've done this, I would think about it as like context in like steps, right? So like you give context into like what is it that you need from them. You need to really understand how is that gonna fuel whatever your outcome is, right? Like what do you need that data for? And then be very specific about what you're asking of them. I think like I've definitely like learned again and again and again how to be more specific, how to give more context. It's never too much. People, this is like an extra thing that you'll be asking them to do. So sort of like helping them understand how it like pieces into all of your work, I think is really important. And then making it easy for them to give that to you, right? So like, you know, I'm very much in like whatever format that you have, thank you. I'll take it however it is and I'll adapt it to what I need, right? Like minimizing the level of work that they have to do, I think is also really important because it's just like, what are the barriers for this person to want to engage with you and want to sort of not want to engage with you, I apologize, but kind of be able to do it in an effective way that also doesn't disturb their day. But Morgan, I'm sure you have more ideas on this as well.
I mean, I think I agree with everything that you said. And then I would also include giving them something in return. So that is like the synthesis, the analysis, whatever, it's the walkthrough, it's helping them connect it back to their work. So it's not just something that they're kind of giving. And kind of with what kind of tying back to what Mariana said about bringing along the stakeholders in the process, kind of helping them see how this connects back to their work and connects back to whatever their pain point is, so that it really comes full circle for them. I think, especially when we get into reporting, we're so often asking teams to provide information. And so making it feel like a group exercise where there's some kind of benefit to them, I think goes a long way versus just asking, or their goals, like, you know, Mariana just put in the chat.
Awesome. So again, quick reminder, thank you again, Mariana and Morgan. Really appreciate your time today and your expertise. Great having you on. Our next webinar is Tuesday, April 23rd. It's another 30-minute quick hit with our friends at Vital Consulting, and we're going to go through an overview of CSR tools. So hopefully we will catch you then. If you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear it. members@pledge1%.org. Brianna, am I forgetting anything?
After you leave the webinar today, first of all, thank you for everyone who joined. Thank you to Mariana. Thank you to Morgan. Thank you, Alicia. And after you leave the webinar today, there will be a quick survey where we'll just ask 2 quick questions and then 1 more open-ended question about some feedback on the content that we're sharing this year. So please, if you have, you know, the time, please do that. That would be so very helpful to us.
Not a measurement and evaluation webinar without a survey, people. So help us out. Hope you all have a great, I don't even know what day it is. Wednesday? Is it Wednesday? Have a great Wednesday, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.